Evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our evening with Earl Spencer, who will be talking about his book, The White Ship. Just on a housekeeping note, if you would like to ask questions this evening to Earl Spencer, then please would you type them into the chat or the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be taking questions later on this evening. So I'm delighted that you can be with us. Absolute pleasure, and such a shame we can't be here. You can't be here in Chorleywood or at the Windsor Festival in the flesh, as it were. And we look forward to welcoming you in the fullness of time. You know, with when things are a little bit better. So Charles Spencer was a reporter on NBC's Today Show from 1986 to 1995, and is the author of 7 books, including 2 Sunday Times bestsellers. Blenheim, Battle for Europe, which was shortlisted for the History Book of the Year, Killers of the King, The Men Who Dared to Execute Charles I, and To Catch a King, Charles II's Great Escape. So tonight, as I say, Charles is here to talk about The White Ship, and I'd like to give you a very warm welcome on behalf of the Windsor Festival and Chorleywood Bookshop. Welcome.
Thanks so much. And yes, I'd like to echo that. I wish I was there in person. I've thoroughly enjoyed my times at Chorleywood and at Windsor talking to the festivals. And it's very strange, you know, this time has so many strange ramifications, but talking to a screen, not knowing the faces that I'm talking to, I just like to build on the Cheryl's introduction there. And yes, so the last 4 books I've done have been on the Stuarts, and that in fact, the last 3 of those have been on the English Civil War. And so what took me from that to, well, the height of the Middle Ages, really, the early Middle Ages. And really, it was this sort of bizarre fascination I've always had. I found my old papers from my time at Oxford in the 80s. And this was my period, actually, my favorite and more successful period. So I think I finally come home to the Middle Ages for this book, at least. And I suppose the starting off point for me was 5 years ago when Alison Weir, who's a very successful and, well, productive historian, she has a very successful sideline in entertaining Americans and other people from overseas and bringing them to England and teaching them about our history. And there's always a theme to her tours. And she very kindly, about 6 years ago, wrote me a very nice review for a book I'd written. And there's no such thing as a free, nice review, apparently, because literally 5 years ago, she called me out of the blue, and I was here at Althorpe, hour and a half north of London. And she said, "So what are you doing this evening?" And I said, "Well, not a lot, actually." And she said, "Well, I'd like you to come to Leeds Castle down in Kent, and you're the keynote speaker tonight." So I said, "Oh, okay, quite happy to do that. But what's the subject?" And she said, "Well, it's on the Queens of England." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll do from the early ones up until 1950 odd. Yeah, I'll give it a go." So I drove from Northamptonshire down to Maidstone in Kent, and I found a cafe and I Googled a speech, unashamedly looking for the best bits about the Queen to present to what I knew would be quite a knowledgeable audience. And from that, while I was thinking, how could I entertain these people who knew at least as much as I did about Boadicea or Queen Mary or Elizabeth I, Victoria, all the staple queens, I threw in some unusual queens. And then I thought, well, actually, just to top it off, I'll put in a nearly queen. And my nearly queen is Matilda. And Matilda is one of several very, very strong female characters from this story, the true story of the White Ship, which I maintain is the greatest maritime disaster that England's ever suffered, and one of the most appalling royal catastrophes of our history as well. And I suppose I'm of a certain age, I'm 56 now, and I'm one of the last generations to have had a very full, complete grounding in English history teaching. And so I knew this story about the White Ship and Matilda and what it all meant. And I sort of assumed this audience would, but they didn't. And then I appreciated that, you know, there are periods of our history which just fall out of circulation, really. I have a son at Bradfield College outside Reading, and about 3 years ago, I said to them, and I'm doing so many talks on my latest book on Charles II, Would you like me to come and do one for you? And the very cheery history teacher said, well, you're welcome to do it, but we don't actually teach the Stuarts anymore. And that was a surprise. But less of a surprise, I suppose, is that Henry I is not so well taught now, because Henry I is the king whose reign is the backdrop to half of my book, the first half. And I like Henry I a lot. I think he's one of our greatest kings. He's sadly forgotten now. And really the pivotal moment in his reign was the White Ship, the sinking of this great vessel. People say, was it the Titanic of its time? Well, no, it was much, much, much more important and serious and catastrophic than that. You know, imagine you put on the Titanic, the only possible male heir to the throne, and various other key members of the royal family, and half the cabinet, and the leading churchmen, and none of them survive. Well, then the Titanic could compete with the White Ship. But this is a unique disaster. And I really build it around some things, because it is an unknown period. I build it around some things that the reader, and I, frankly, know a little bit about. 1066 is really my launching point in this book. And, you know, this is a period of very strong kings. And William the Conqueror is the sort of grandfather of this story. He who was probably the legitimate King of England. He'd been promised the crown of England by the childless Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor. And the man who seized and probably stole the crown from him, Harold Godwinson, was a man who had sworn on oath that he would not stand in the way of William the Conqueror. So William, after Edward the Confessor's death and after Harold seized the throne, raised an army and built a fleet, a great fleet. The Bayeux Tapestry shows all these trees being chopped down across the Norman coast to build more ships. And the most noteworthy ship of the entire invasion fleet in 1066 was the Mora, M-O-R-A. The Mora was built secretly in the harbour of Barfleur. Barfleur is east of Cherbourg, and it was the great harbour in northern Normandy at this time. And it was built secretly by Matilda of Flanders, who was William the Conqueror's wife. She wanted to support her husband's almighty gamble for the throne of England in a very tangible way, by giving him a mighty ship. And we can see, I refer again to the Bayeux Tapestry. If you look there, you can see the Mora. It was a very substantial ship, much bigger than the other long ships that took to the coast of the south coast of England and landed their troops there. And in a way, I think we have to just look briefly. I am not a structural engineer of any kind, but we have to look at the strengths and weaknesses of these ships and the longevity of them. You know, the Mora was very little different to the large ships, the larger long ships that had come from the Viking invasions down from Scandinavia into more mainland Europe, particularly along the French coast. And they're what are described as clinker built, which basically means they're one plank placed upon another and then pinned together with a nail, and then a sort of, you know, caulking inside to keep some sort of padding, and then another layer. But I'd say very flimsy. Very good if you want a fast raiding ship, not good if you happen to strike a rock. And so for several hundred years, this was the build that the Vikings, then the Normans, and then the Anglo-Normans used for their ships. Now, William the Conqueror is a fascinating man of action. This Duke of Normandy who captures England. England was this almighty prize at this time, so wealthy, with wonderful coinage, great natural wealth. A lot of people had hoped to secure England when Edward the Confessor died, a lot of Scandinavian contenders as well. But William won the prize. And then, you know, he dealt with problems. What I love about history is you see these mighty figures, but they deal with problems that anyone can relate to. And particularly with him, he had big problems with his family. His wife and he were very, very happy. And there's no hint, actually, of mistresses or illegitimate children when William the Conqueror was on the throne. But there were probably 10 children, maybe 9, and there were definitely 4 sons that survived infancy. And of these, one of them, Richard, died very young, as a teenage boy, in a hunting accident in the New Forest. Hunting was a very dangerous pursuit, and we'll see other people die from that. But the eldest son was Robert Curthose. Curthose, rather an unpleasant nickname thought up by his father for the eldest son, because it was basically meant short legs, and quite a cruel little nickname for a father to think of for his son. And there was an enormous amount of tension between William the Conqueror and Robert Curthose, which grew and grew. Curthose was much the eldest son. He wanted power, he wanted influence, he wanted money. He had an enormous number of hangers-on who were bleeding him dry, real leeches who expected him to provide for them. And Curthose was weak. He wanted to please his followers. He was flattered by them, but he didn't really understand money. He didn't understand, he was incontinent with money. And he had his mother to start with, helping to try and bring about peace between her eldest boy and her husband, the Conqueror. But after she died, things got very dire between them, and they were essentially involved in a civil war. And it's reckoned that the most depressingly awful moment that William had in any conflict was when fighting his own son, and Robert Curthose unhorsed him and wounded him. Anyway, they were still at war when William the Conqueror was fighting in 1087. And by this stage, he was quite far removed from the sort of glamorous, energetic, fighting man of his youth. He had become incredibly bloated. And while riding into action one day, the pommel of his saddle thrust deep into his enormous gut and punctured various organs. And he was taken to a monastery where it was quite clear he was dying. And around his deathbed, the one constant was his son, the 4th son, who would become the magnificent Henry I, who I've already referred to. And William was lying there, surrounded by advisors who were really only interested in themselves. The bishops and barons of Normandy were telling him he had to leave the Norman lands of his birth to his eldest son, Robert Curthose. Whatever difficulties they had had, whatever fighting they had endured, it was right for Normandy to go to the eldest son. And William was persuaded, probably against his better judgment, to allow that to happen. But in return, he insisted that the prize that he had won during his life was his to give to whoever he wanted. And he decided to give it to his 2nd son, William Rufus. William Rufus, it's hard to think of many great things about him, but he was a very, very good soldier. He was rough. He was fantastically lustful. He was a great enemy of the church. He was an enemy of his own people in a way. You know, when William Rufus rode around with his court, people would retreat and hide from it. It was like an invading army. It would come to steal and rape and pillage. But this was the man that William the Conqueror chose as his English successor on the throne here, I think because he was a very good soldier, and William the Conqueror wanted to ensure that England remained in his family for generations to come. The 4th son, because already we've lost Richard, remember, in the hunting accident, but the 4th son, Henry, loyal, had a very good relationship with his father, was expecting some sizable inheritance. But I think he'd been brought up for the church, and William hadn't really got much in mind for him at this stage. We know that Henry was quite educated and that he was in the court, the semi-official court of a bishop in England, being brought up by him. Anyway, Henry asked what he was going to get. And William the Conqueror told him, well, actually, I'm going to give you an enormous sum of money, but no lands, no title. And Henry was distraught. He thought, well, what am I going to do with that? That's not much good. And he said that to his father. And his father said, no, no, no. One day you will be greater than each of your brothers. Anyway, Henry I was a man who had a love of money. And when his father died, he had the silver that his father had bequeathed him carefully weighed and then hid it away. And then he went to his father's funeral, which was an extraordinary affair. First of all, a man got up in the congregation and started haranguing everybody, claiming that William the Conqueror had stolen land from his family and he wanted it back now. He was hushed up and moved along. But then it all got rather gruesome, I'm afraid. I mentioned that William wasn't quite the svelte figure of his youth, but the sarcophagus that had been carved, the stone tomb, as it were, that had been carved for his eternal resting place for his remains, was too small to take his hulking carcass. And when the monks tried to squeeze it in, the Duke's stomach just erupted into a sort of putrid mass. And I'm sorry, because I'm sure a lot of you have just eaten your dinner quite recently. But anyway, the stench was so appalling that nearly everyone fled, apart from a few monks who carried out the funeral correctly. So then we have Henry, the youngest son, rather exposed. You know, his two brothers were often at each other's throats. And Henry is the junior one of the three, by far the junior one of the three surviving sons of the Conqueror, was called upon by one and then the other to support the one brother against the other. And he was just this sort of third wheel in a way, who had no independent power. He was really reliant on the crusts that his elder brothers threw his way. And he had a wretched youth. He was on the move the whole time, really, trying to find a living. He was clearly a capable soldier, so his brothers wanted to rely on him. At the same time, they stole from him. He used the money that he had inherited from William the Conqueror to buy up chunks near Brittany. He bought Mont Saint-Michel. But even then, he had to retreat from his brothers, who came up with a secret pact to deprive him of everything. And he made a stand at Mont Saint-Michel. And of course, those of you who can picture it in your head, it's a place of amazing natural defense, and the monks there helped him, and he had got still some money, and he had good mercenaries, but there wasn't much fresh water on the mount. And eventually, Henry bluffed his way. He said to his brother, Robert Curthose, look, my men and I are going to run out of water. We're going to die of thirst. Please send us some. And Curthose sent them not only water, but some of the finest wine. A great moment of chivalry, really. And this resulted in a huge disagreement between Curthose and the second brother, William Rufus. And eventually we have poor Henry thrown into prison at one stage by his brother, and then living in complete poverty in France for a little bit with a handful of supporters. And really his youth isn't much fun at all. And he's mocked by relatives. They think he's a little uncouth, although he can read, which none of them can, although he's considered quite learned, which very few of them wanted to be. He was seen as a bit of a disappointment, because whereas they liked the grand gesture of going hunting after deer and wild boars, that was in a superb hunting party. But for Henry, he had the family addiction to hunting, but he rather liked the more down at heel version of it. He had his own pack of hounds and his own horn, and he would lead his hounds off into the woods and go hunting by himself. And this was thought by some of his cousins to be a bit in for a dig. They thought it was a bit low, and they underestimated him. Meanwhile, Robert Curthose proved to be an appalling Duke of Normandy. Terrible. I mean, the place dissolved into chaos, and he never had enough money to pay his troops or his supporters. And in the end, he was saved by the calling of the First Crusade in 1096 by Pope Urban. The Pope was trying to establish some leadership over the great princes of Western Europe. And that's one of the reasons he called the Crusade. And one of the things he decreed was that anyone who went on crusade, their possessions would be essentially sacrosanct, and that brother must stop fighting brother. So Robert Curthose went off to the First Crusade to his younger brother, William Rufus. And actually, he went off and had the high point of his life in terms of a man, a leader. He was a great general when it came to the Crusades, and he became a very distinguished figure. But William Rufus took over Normandy while his brother was away and basically ravaged that, trying to get the money back from the investment of his mortgage. And so we have this sort of toing and froing and a very difficult period for the brothers who were the sons of William the Conqueror, until suddenly, out of the blue, everything changes. And I now take you to August 1100. And William Rufus has had this history, a very difficult history for 13 years of being at loggerheads with the church in England. He decides that the most important thing that archbishops and bishops can do is be vacant. He wants their lands, he wants their estates, he wants their sees, and he wants their income. So when an archbishop moves along or dies, or a bishop equally, he doesn't fill the vacancy, he takes the money, the revenue instead. And this brings him into direct attack, loggerheads really, with the established church and with the papacy. And actually, there is a moment when he recants and regrets his appalling behavior towards the church, when he got very ill in the 1090s. And it looked very much though he was going to die of a stomach problem. And he was taken to the monks in Gloucester, who were considered very good at medicine. And they managed to convince him that if he didn't mend his ways, he was going to die. And it looked like he was going to die then, and he had better repent. And one of the things during this moment of great weakness and physical decay that William Rufus agreed to do was to appoint one of the more learned men of the church in Europe at this time, a man called Anselm, who had grown up in what we now know as the Italian Alps, very spiritual figure. And he asked Anselm to become Archbishop of Canterbury. And Anselm said he would, but at the same time, he wanted William Rufus to promise to put everything right in the church, to not defile it, to not rape it, and to accept Anselm as his spiritual guide. William Rufus thought he was about to die and meet his maker and be judged, so he quickly agreed to this. But really what happened was, when he got better, the agreement fell away, and Anselm and the king, William Rufus, ended up with such a hostility between the two of them that Anselm was exiled. And William Rufus even made him go through the humiliation of being sort of searched on the beach at Dover before he left the country. So yes, the beginning of August 1100, William Rufus woke up after a terrible night's sleep. He was in the New Forest, ready to go hunting. But that night before, he had this dream, apparitions that came to him. Somebody slit open a vein in his dream and out poured sort of red gas instead of blood. And he was very shaken by this. And he made sure that guards stayed with him for the rest of the night. And when he got up in the morning, he was a bit of a swaggering buffoon. He pretended none of this mattered, but he got a letter from the Bishop of Gloucester saying, look, my monks have been having dreams that you're going to die because you've been so appalling to the church. And he laughed this off, and he dished out these new hunting arrows to his favorite friends and courtiers who were going into the woods with him. And off they went. It was by this stage, actually, early afternoon. And we don't know who fired the fatal arrow. There's a man called William Tyrrell whose name is associated with this, but even on his deathbed, he swore it wasn't him. It could have just been a freak accident, an arrow ricocheting off the flank of a deer or off a tree, for instance. Or it could have been something more sinister, but interestingly, nobody thought at the time that it was an assassination. Anyway, an arrow plugged into William Rufus's chest, and we know that he slid onto his knees without a word and then just toppled forward and drove the shaft of the arrow deep into his chest, and he died. And it's a fitting end to a barbarian. He had done so much damage to the church that he was deprived by God in that moment of being able to repent. And it's interesting, with corpses of kings at this time, they were treated terribly badly. William the Conqueror, when he died, eventually died on his deathbed, the barons ran to look after their possessions and protect them against anyone who was going to try and take advantage of this kingless state. But William the Conqueror's servants just stripped him of all his jewels and stole from him effectively. Equally, with William Rufus lying stiffening in death on the floor of the New Forest, he was slung first over a horse and then into a cart. And people said he looked like a dead wild boar just slung in the back. And he was taken off to a rather humble funeral for a king. But that was not the end of this story. It was the beginning, really, of Henry I's tale. And this much underestimated youngest son raced to Winchester, where he took the treasury. The great royal treasury was based there. And then he rode on to Westminster Abbey, where he was crowned pretty much straight away. And I've mentioned Robert Curthose. You know, he really did expect it was his turn at last to take England if something happened to William Rufus. In fact, they'd agreed that if anything happened to one or the other without a legitimate male heir, that's what would happen. They would get both territories. And he was coming back from the Crusades with this massively enhanced reputation, with a very wealthy wife who he had found in the Norman areas of southern Italy. And he wanted England. And within a year, he had invaded the south coast of England, and he was making his way up through Hampshire. And it looked like there was going to be an almighty battle between the forces of William Rufus, of Henry and of Robert Curthose. But quite interesting when I look at this time how influential the barons were. And they basically told both their leaders, no, we're not going to fight because we're going to kill each other, or kill our brothers and kill our cousins. We're not having that. You're going to make peace. And so that was when Robert Curthose finally acknowledged Henry as the King of England. And he would go back to Normandy with a pension from his wealthy English king of a brother. And that's how it sort of looked it would settle. But Henry I was not going to stop there. He had already, and he looked at the mess that his eldest brother was making of ruling Normandy, and he thought he could do a lot better. So did other people. Again, the self-interest. People were fed up with the chaos that Robert Curthose was presiding over. And gradually, Henry built up alliances in Normandy. And in 1106, at the Battle of Tinchebrai, he not only defeated his brother, Robert Curthose, but he cast him into prison for an extremely long time. Robert Curthose died exceptionally old for his time in his 80s, and he spent that time in prison. I think he quite enjoyed prison, or certainly adapted to it. He was kept, first of all, down in Devizes in Wiltshire, and then he was moved to South Wales. And we know that he spent his time, he learnt Welsh, he wrote poetry. We have a poem that he wrote still. It's about an oak tree. And then really, Henry set about re-establishing his reign. And he'd already done an enormous amount of groundwork in England, and he set about doing the same in Normandy. Now, as King of England, why I say he's great is, well, there's several reasons. He really had a plan. He realized how undermining the great aristocrats were. So he set about bringing them to heel. And he really made examples of the worst ones. The very, very worst family, I think, in this whole story, have the surname of de Bellême. And their leader was this appalling psychopath, in my view, called Robert de Bellême. Robert was just one of those people. He was unfazed by religious belief. This is at a time when, you know, religious superstition counted for an awful lot with people, and it kept people under control, I think. Robert de Bellême, not being Christian, was freed from all these constraints, and he set about building on his huge power base. He had inherited enormously from his father, and he would from his mother as well. And he was very, very cruel. When he was reminded by the church that he should be obeying Lent and observing the strictures of Lent, he asked what they were. And the church replied, well, you know, you should, for a start, be fasting. So Robert de Bellême, to sort of toe the line a little bit, but really to abuse everything that the church stood for, said, okay. And he made 300 of the prisoners in his dungeon starve to death. There's another appalling tale of this man who lost his temper with a godson of his. The godson's father had displeased Robert de Bellême, and so Robert de Bellême ripped the boy's eyes out with his thumbnails. He was absolutely appalling. And in terms of royal power, he was a really big threat. He controlled huge chunks of England. And he set about just doing what he felt like, thinking that Henry I was much less capable than he was. And one of the great sins at this time was to build castles without royal licensing. And de Bellême did this. In the end, Henry just stockpiled all of the complaints, all the legal issues he could have against de Bellême, and then summoned him to answer nearly 50 of them. And de Bellême and his very powerful brothers, one had married the daughter of a king of Ireland, and they were a very connected, very powerful family. They'd really benefited from being the favorites of William Rufus. They decided to stand united against Henry I, and they lost. He was stronger than them, and he banished them from England. And this was really a sort of moment when I think Henry decided he could not rely on these very entitled, powerful aristocrats to support his dynasty. So he brought up these men. One of the chroniclers writes about he brought them up out of the dust. He looked at very, very able people from the lower ranks of society, educated, but not from grand backgrounds. And he promoted them because he knew he could rely on them. They owed all their power, all their resources to the king's favor. And they tended to be very, very loyal to the crown as a result. At the same time, he set about making sure that his finances, the crown's finances, were very secure. He set up a system that still exists today in England, the Exchequer, basically the treasury. And this got its name from a sort of a counting table, a very, very large square counting table with a ridge around it, which meant things didn't roll off it. And then counters on a checkerboard, a very early form of abacus or computer. And those of you who are English who are watching, who are over 55, say, will remember how impossible the coinage was in England before decimalisation. How to do maths when you have 12 shillings, whatever it is. Was it 12 pence the shilling and 20 shillings to the pound? I don't know what it was, but it was all it wasn't tens and hundreds anyway. But this checkerboard could work it all out in front of people with witnesses there. And the sheriffs of each county of England there's one sheriff for each county, they had to go to the Exchequer twice a year and account for all the money that county owed to the crown. A lot of these sheriffs were not even literate. So the officials who oversaw the Exchequer devised these sort of rulers, wooden rulers, and they put equal notches on both sides, which delineated the money paid and the money owed. And then the ruler was split down the middle, and the receipt of half of it was given to the sheriff, and he was told to pay in what was still owing. At the same time, on a sort of more mundane level, the English coinage had always been very, very profitable for the kings of England. It was licensed out to people who had mints, around 60 mints across England. And every 3 years, the king would change the design of his coins, and the minters would have to pay a new license. It was all very, very good news for the royal coffers. But at the same time, Henry realized that the most essential thing to give confidence to his people and who they traded with was to keep a level of purity to the coinage, which was equivalent really to 93% silver. And this he did, and people were warned, do not mess with the coinage. If you do, it'll be treated as treason. And those of you who are watching in Windsor, in 1124 at Easter, a lot of the people who had licenses for minting coins were invited to come to Windsor for Easter. And they all thought this was going to be a huge privilege. I'm afraid it was the opposite. These were men who Henry had been informed had been messing around with his coins, adulterating the silver. And they were relieved, each of these men were relieved their right hand and their genitals. And that seemed to sort out the coinage problems for a while. He was a very thorough, very cruel man by our standards. But I think, and I'm not justifying what he did, I think part of this is down to what was the real power of a king at this time. It was really down to example. You had to lead by example. And warn people that if they crossed you, terrible things would happen. And do you know, I think he was very successful. And a lot of his success was built around the idea of establishing a dynasty. His elder brothers did not, in the end, leave any male heirs that survived beyond young manhood. And most of them were illegitimate anyway. But Henry, right from the beginning, realized that his duty, his prime duty, was to produce an heir and found a dynasty. The fourth son was going to do what the other sons were going to fail to do. Very early on in his reign, he decided on a clever choice of bride, although several chroniclers say that the couple were in love. And he got engaged to marry, and then did marry, Matilda of Scotland, a young princess who, although we see her name was of Scotland, she was actually of ancient English bloodline, going all the way back to Alfred the Great. This is very popular. The Norman conquest had been deeply traumatic for the people of present-day England, and this was seen as a way of binding up the wounds a bit. So at first there was a daughter of this marriage, Matilda, the one who we met as the Nearly Queen in my cobbled together speech at Leeds Castle. And she was sent away as a young girl to marry the Emperor of Germany, a position that would have been later known as Holy Roman Emperor, controlling a huge swathe of Europe. And she went and did a very good job there, actually, even despite her youth. You know, when her husband was away fighting, usually fighting the French, she would legislate in his place and stand in for him, and did a very, very, admirable job. And then there was one son from this marriage, and he was called William, and he was known as William Atheling. Atheling's rather like Prince of Wales. It meant, you know, the designated future king. What do we know about him? Well, it's very hard to get a fair picture of him. He was obviously a good-looking young boy, and he was blonde, and he was much loved by his father. And we know that that is very unusual, actually. The medieval kings not necessarily overly enamored of their own offspring. But when Henry I was away fighting in France, where he spent half his reign was fighting in France, trying to hold on to Normandy, he wrote letters to Anselm, his archbishop now, asking him to keep a paternal eye on his children because he was away. And Henry brought William the Atheling into a lot of his own responsibilities to sort of bring the boy on, to teach him what it was going to be like to be king. He went on diplomatic missions. And in the great campaigns between 1116 and 1119, when the great hostility of Henry's reign came to a head, it's when he took on Louis the Fat, the marvelously named and hugely girthed King of France, in a sort of life or death struggle to try and get Louis to acknowledge William the Atheling as the future Duke of Normandy. Then William Atheling was on campaign, we know certainly for some of that. And he saw battle at Bremule, which was the great victory that England had over France in 1119. And it's after this that we get really to the White Ship. And so after these great triumphs, 20 years on the throne of England, 14 years as Duke of Normandy, Henry I has laid to rest the French threat. He has his son, his one son, acknowledged to take on all of the greatness that he has accrued. And they arrive at Barfleur, the same harbour where the ship, the Mora, was built for William the Conqueror. And they are going to go back to Southampton on the south coast of England, a journey that would have taken 10 or 12 hours with a suitable wind, when a man comes forward and says, I'm the captain of the greatest ship here, and it was my father's honour to be the captain of the Mora in 1066. I demand the honour of taking you back in triumph in this greatest moment of your reign to England. And Henry I is rather organised and rather immune to flattery. And he says, no, I've made my arrangements, but yes, your ship's good. The White Ship is a very fine vessel. And I'd love you to take my treasure and my son, William the Eighthling, and many of my other children. Henry I is our most fertile monarch. He had 22 illegitimate children. So some of them got on the White Ship. Some of the great bureaucrats I told you about, who Henry had raised from the dust, and many of his greatest generals, his cousins, his nephews, the great landowners of England, they all got on the White Ship. Henry set off early that evening of the 25th of November, 1120, almost exactly 900 years ago from tonight. And he set off on a rather uneventful voyage north to Southampton. William the Eighthling was flattered by the adulation of his companions and the crew, who were amazed that they had the honor of taking this golden child back to England. And Henry had left behind huge caskets of wine, which William Eighthling dished out to his companions and to the crew. And they all got rip-roaringly drunk. And this actually was at a time when people were terrified of the sea. Very, very few, tiny, tiny percentage of people could swim. There was no recreational swimming. And if you read the poetry, I dig up a few bits in the book of the poetry of the time. The sea was a place of danger, beauty, but big danger, with a huge amount of very frightening animals lurking underneath, sea elephants, sea lions and wolves, and even goats waiting to devour hapless sailors. Anyway, because of this fear, it was often the case that very grand vessels, such as the White Ship, would be blessed before a voyage. And some monks appeared to bless the White Ship. And as they did so, the sort of drunken oafs who were surrounding William the Eighthling jumped off the ship and chased them away. And you can imagine what people thought of that later. Eventually, a little before midnight, the White Ship slipped anchor and set off towards Southampton. And the cry went up among these drunken passengers of noble birth and huge authority that they must beat King Henry I's ship back to Southampton. And the crew thought this was a wonderful idea, and they were drunk on their oars, and they had a huge number of rowers there. And out of Barfleur, as they set sail, they actually dropped the sail far too soon. And I think the combination of the drink, the speed of the oarsmen, the premature dropping of the sail, I think it completely confused the helmsman, who was probably drunk himself. And they hit the Key Berth Rock, which is still there today. You can see it at low tide. Hit it very hard. And the ship, the White Ship, split into pieces. And luckily for me, there is one eyewitness who survived this disaster. We know from this man, the humblest man on board, what happened next. Barreau the butcher had pursued his royal and aristocratic creditors onto the boat to get some debts paid. And he managed to scramble onto a mast, and he saw the men of the boat, the crew, trying to push the White Ship free, but only making the wound in her side worse. And then there's an appalling moment, because William the Eighthling was such a precious being. His bodyguards threw him into a rowing boat and were keen to get him away as quickly as possible, when he heard his half-sister, the Countess of Perche, screaming for help and screaming abuse at him for being so unmanly as to leave her to die. And Barreau tells us that William Eighthling ordered his crew to turn round to go and rescue her. But they had to go through all these thrashing, drowning people who latched onto the side of the little boat and took it and the prince down. Nobody wanted to tell Henry what had happened. When Barreau was finally found by fishermen, the sole survivor of the 300 people on the White Ship, this terrible story he had of all of these great people dying was something that nobody wanted to share with this frightening king. And eventually, one of the king's nephews persuaded a little page boy to go in, and the king bellowed and fell to the ground. And they say he never smiled again in the remaining 15 years of his reign. Well, that may be an exaggeration, but we know he never had another male heir. He quickly married, within 2 months of the disaster, he married, because he was widowed, a beautiful young girl called the Fair Maid of Brabant, Queen Adeliza. And they kept her by his side for a very long time to try and get him to produce an heir, but it never worked. Not a problem from her side, because after his death, she went on to marry someone else and had 6 children. And Henry was left with this appalling, gut-wrenching thought that everything he was building up was going to end in disaster if he couldn't hand it on safely. His only legitimate daughter, Matilda, was widowed herself, and she came back to England. And so he cobbled together this agreement among the barons and bishops that they would acknowledge her as his successor. But when he died in 1135, famously from having eaten too many lampreys, sort of eel, people forgot that promise. And it's a man who was on the White Ship who stole the crown, not Barreau the Butcher, but Stephen of Blois, a nephew of Henry I, who had been on the White Ship, ready to sail on the doomed voyage, when he had an appalling attack of diarrhea. And to save himself from the embarrassment of dealing with that on an open ship overnight, he got off. And he is the man who took the throne from Matilda. And what followed, and this is where I'm going to draw to a close, because I'm only halfway through my book, and you don't need to hear the rest in so much detail. What followed was an appalling civil war, absolutely the most blood-chilling time. In fact, the monks who wrote about the period said that blood descended on England at this time. For 19 years, people were totally unsafe in their home on the road. And they look back with nostalgia at Henry I's reign. And he knew all along that once he had lost his son on the White Ship, that his dynasty was imperiled. And so it was, because in 1154, when Stephen eventually died, there was a complete change of dynasty. All because of the White Ship. The Plantagenets took the throne of England, and they held it until the Tudors took over in 1485. It's very hard to think of a moment in English history when one accident caused so much mayhem. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating and so detailed. That was a wonderful, wonderful explanation. The book is absolutely beautiful, and it's got some lovely sort of pictures and plates in it. And how did you sort of choose these and research and know how to sort of cull, because obviously there's so much research, there's presumably a lot of material, and it's absolutely beautiful book. So can you sort of explain how you came to these,
Well, thank you. Yes. Well, it's very interesting. Yeah, I took a lot of trouble over the plates, the illustrations, because I have to bring it all alive. It's one thing to do it in writing, but I want to give people a true feeling of the time. So to see some of those ancient images, some of them are surprisingly colourful, and to see the actual characters involved is very important, I think. The research was tricky. I mentioned in my sort of intro that all the things I've written for the English Civil War, I really know where those documents are. There's a lot of them. But with this, it was a brand new period for me. And it took me a year of reading everything I could on this period, both the French and English. And a lot of it was from monks, because they had the learning to write and the time. And it's really a case of following all of it. And I took a year to absorb that before properly researching. But when I write, it's all about people watching. I'm not here to try and dry facts. This is about human beings. I want to get the facts right, but I drive a narrative. I'm a narrative historian, not an academic one. So what I like to do is I write books which I want people to find a page turner. I don't want to read a history book except for research, where I think, oh my goodness, this is doing me good. I want it to be much more than that. And I have in mind, when I write these books, I lived when I was at Oxford University, I lived with this very nice, very intelligent man called Andrew. There were 4 of us who lived in a house together. and he reads about one book a year. And I always think, I want to write the book that that man would buy, you know? And luckily he does, because he's a loyal friend. But it's that's what I'm trying to do, is get people to engage with history in a sort of fun way.
You've sort of partly answered, we've got a question here from Kathy, and you've partly answered that, you know, how long did it take you to research this book? But interesting part of the question is, did you need fluent French to be able to do so?
That's a very good question, actually, because I have quite fluent French, but a lot of the things here are ancient French and Norman, and they're different. I mean, do you know, it's one of those things, when someone tells you, oh, that's what that means, then you go, of course it does, you know, because that's the way it is. It makes sense, it fits. But I had to resort to two experts, and one of them was an expert in ancient French and Norman. Oh. And she is at Cambridge University. And I just said, look, I'm struggling. I could do some of it, but I need your help. And she's called Laura Bailey, not the model, but a very fine historian. And she was very helpful indeed. And then I also, because this is a new period for me and I didn't want to make any silly mistakes, I went to another academic, again happened to be at Cambridge, just to check that I got the dates right. I hate people messing around with what I write, but I didn't want to make mistakes, so I went for that. But do you know that the French question is good, because, yeah, I mean, very few people spoke what we would recognize as English. I mean, when Henry I learned English, and his family thought that was really sort of unnecessary. I mean, William the Conqueror never learned English. He had a few stabs at it, but he was A, very busy, and B, lacked concentration, really. So no, you're right, a lot of it is in some form of French. Mm. The other thing I'd say, you know, about this book was that it's a sort of incredibly, it was such a nice spine to hang everything on, this incredibly dramatic moment, because I love bringing characters back to life. And there are so many fabulous people. I didn't have time to talk about one of the king's men, a man who he found in total obscurity, just a country priest in Normandy. It becomes Roger of Salisbury, effectively prime minister, long before that office existed. And he starts on this ascent to enormous power because he has this incredible ability as a priest to deal with the Roman Catholic mass in a very efficient way. And to somebody as busy as Henry I, Henry I either wanted to be on the battlefield, hunting, or governing. He hadn't got time. He had to do religion because it was a part of his life, and he'd been brought up as a very religious boy by his father. William the Conqueror was very punctilious about religious matters and had several services a day when he could. But at the same time, you know, Roger of Salisbury could deal with that and give Henry time to get on with governing. And he is a fascinating king. So I brushed over him briefly there. But what I like is the balance he had to his day. And he used to do the real hard work of governing in the morning and then have a rather leisurely lunch. You know, it wasn't a big eater. And I think that's probably what killed him when he ate the lampreys. It was just too rich for him. But then he liked to have an afternoon, obviously when he's not fighting, you know, an afternoon of amusement and people having what we call a laugh together and a bit of intellectual chat. And you know, I think he's an incredibly balanced and multi-layered king. And I've been campaigning since I wrote this book to try and get him buried correctly, because he is not a king under a car park, but he is a king under something not ideal. He built for himself a resting place of huge magnificence. It was an abbey in Reading to the west of London. And it cost him the equivalent now of £500 million. It was magnificent. But Henry VIII sort of ended its life as an abbey. And then in the 1640s, Charles I blew it up in the English Civil War. And what you see now in Reading is a series of rather broken down walls. But I was so intrigued about where he ended up. And I've been working with some experts in Reading. And it's pretty well certain that he is under a school extension near the Abbey, because he was buried. Yeah, he was buried at the high altar, and we reckon he's still there. And I approached indirectly. I approached Westminster Abbey and said, "Look, surely you'll have him." And I got a rather snooty answer: "Well, we're not doing burials anymore." And they could have him cremated and have a plaque, which I didn't think is really it's not very sort of medieval and kingly, is it? And so I don't know what we're going to do, but I will campaign for him because he deserves better. And also, religion mattered so much to these people, and they left so much in perpetuity, these great estates to support their foundations. And you just, in some way, we should honor what they wanted. And he did not want to be buried under an add-on to a school.
No, of course. So for such an important historical event, why do you think it's so overlooked when it comes to school teaching, or our general knowledge? It's just not in the fore.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I normally I'd be able to look around the audience, but I can't now. And I don't know who these people are who are watching, but if they're my age or above, and English, they may have cut their historical teeth on a wonderful, very old-fashioned and completely bonkers book, but it's called Our Island Story by H.E. Marshall.
Yeah, yes.
And it was very beautiful coloured plates, illustrations, which bring things to life. If you read that, it was really the story of Britain from Boadicea, the ancient queen against the Romans, through to the death of Queen Victoria at the beginning of the 20th century. And if you look at the chapter on Henry I, it is nearly all about the White Ship. And if I'd written this book 100 or 200 years ago, I'd had to have started by apologizing for picking such a hackneyed subject, because, everyone knew about it so much. And then even when, Winston Churchill wrote The History of the English-Speaking People, if you look at that, there's a chunk on the White Ship. So I do think it's fashion. I do think people think, oh, well, they do the conquest, and then they sort of jump to Magna Carta maybe in 1215. Well, there wouldn't have been a Magna Carta if the White Ship hadn't sunk, in that there wouldn't have been a King John, there wouldn't have been Richard the Lionheart. They would, if they'd existed at all, there'd have been some distant cousins knocking around somewhere in France. So, it's this extraordinary thing. But I tell you, it has whetted my appetite. And people say to me, oh, is your next book going to be another medieval one? I don't know about that. But I end on such an intriguing king. So after this terrible bloodshed of the Civil War, you end up with this sort of compromise, because King Stephen, the man who in sliding doors fashion got off the White Ship and manages to become king, and Queen Matilda, they have two blocks of power which neither can win. Queen Matilda holds the west and southwest of England. Stephen holds London and much of the rest of England. So the compromise is brought about, again, by the very powerful bishops and barons, that what they'll do is they will cut out Stephen's line. When he dies, that's it for his family. And then in return, Matilda's son, Henry II, will take over. And he's a fantastic character in his own right. So I'm quite intrigued by that, but we'll see.
I've heard you describe the book as a cross between Game of Thrones and Titanic. It's obviously incredibly filmic. I mean, is there a film or is there any news on that front, or television? Or
I would love it to. Yeah, I have been talking to people in Hollywood actually about it, with possibly 1066 being the first half, and then The White Ship being the sort of sequel, and then the fallout being this terrible civil war. So yeah, I'm working on it because I think it is so, I can see it and I just think, wow, what a drama. And if you think how much excitement there is over Titanic and of course Game of Thrones, and to distill the two stories into one true event and its outcome. I mean, it would be sad if it wasn't the case. But then I don't have much faith in Hollywood. I wrote a book 6 years ago on the execution of Charles I, and I met these producers in Hollywood, and I thought it's going really, really well. And they said, but would it be all right if Charles I died a few years later? And then I said, well, he'd have liked it. but I'm afraid history is history, you know. So they do take the odd liberty.
Yeah, that's more than the odd liberty.
Yes. Anyway.
Um, a question here, or a comment from Jane, saying, "I love this film idea, and please write about Henry II."
I love Henry II. So my favourite fact about Henry II is that he had this terrible temper. The Plantagenets had a famously awful temper because they were supposedly descended from the devil's daughter. Anyway, Henry II was very touchy. If somebody else was complimented in his presence, he got very jealous. And his particular enemy was the King of Scotland. And somebody made the massive error of saying how wonderful King of Scotland was in Henry II's hearing. And they say that he lost his temper so badly that he started to eat his own mattress. And I think, well, that's a fascinating character. I love characters, and I'm not sure there's a book in that, but I could give it a go.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, have you started writing your next book? I know, obviously, you're sort of just, it seems.
Yeah, there's a lot of promotion. You know, so many books out at the moment, and I have to do this. I have to love it. I usually go to millions of literary festivals, but I'm giving this everything. And then I have scribbled some things down for the next one, but we'll see. I haven't even troubled my publishers with it yet, so it's probably bad luck to even talk about it.
Definitely. We don't want to do that. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute privilege and pleasure, and to hear all about this fantastic, exciting book. That obviously will make great Christmas presents. So we've got lots of signed copies at the Chorleywood Bookshop, so which you have kindly signed for us, which is brilliant. And so, all the very best with the book. And
thanks so much.
It's going to be really, really popular at Christmas.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I'm not with a commercial hat on, but I do think it is that book you can give somebody who likes history but doesn't have to have an encyclopedic knowledge. That's the aim. I want people to pick that book up and think, wow, and then be encouraged to go and buy someone else's history book. So this is a gateway into history, hopefully.
Yeah, very readable and accessible and exciting, and adventure story, really.
Hope so.
True.
And true, yes.
So
thank you for having me anyway.
No, well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining us. And I believe we have had some guests from Pennsylvania, USA. So I hope they're here this evening, but I'll be there morning, whatever. But no, it's brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.